Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming up and joining me here on stage.
Absolutely.
And so what we're going to talk about today is open source and open standards in IoT. One of the common threads that you might have seen, we'll call that pun partially intended, through the products that we launch is each one of those products we talked about is powered by some very powerful pre-existing open source technology that we've been able to incorporate into our technology stack. And that starts with OpenThread, which is the basis of particle mesh, Node-RED, which is the basis of the IoT rules engine, and Visual Studio Code, which is the basis of Particle Workbench. And so we wanted to bring representatives of each of these groups to have a conversation about what open source means, generally speaking, within their company's goals, but also specifically within IoT. And maybe I'll start by asking everybody to introduce themselves. Amanda and Greg, you gave a brief version. Grant, we're seeing you here for the first time. So why don't we start with Grant? Maybe talk a little bit about yourself, about the Thread Group, and what are some of the things that you've done.
Absolutely. So one of the two jobs I do is president of the Thread Group. The Thread Group's been in operation now for about, 4 years, since roughly 2014. And then the other hat I wear, I'm also a principal engineer at Google, where I lead our IoT technologies team in our Google Home division, which also includes Nest. So we've got a lot of experience building technologies like Thread through the kind of product experience that we bring to the table from Google and, of course, all the other members that we have in the Thread Group.
Awesome. Thanks, Grant. And Amanda, why don't you go a little bit deeper into your history? You talked about you've been at Microsoft for 17 years, is that right?
17 years, yeah. I actually started in programming languages and working on kind of the interface between .NET and Win32. And then from there, I kind of started to work a little bit more on the programming environment, the code editor, debuggers, things like that. And then from there, just kind of continued to expand my role to work on more platform things. I've worked on Windows, Office, Azure, Xbox, you name a product at Microsoft, I've probably worked on their developer platform, as well as our actual developer tools. So over the past couple of years, I've kind of taken responsibility for not just VS Code, but also for Visual Studio as well.
Awesome. And Greg, you want to talk more about your history at IBM?
Sure, a little bit of history, I guess. First, I'm an involuntary IBM employee. I didn't choose to work there. The company I worked for got purchased about 10 years ago, so I've got 10 years of the organization, which shocks me that I was there 10 years. But it's actually pretty neat. I've had about 10 different jobs in the 10 years there. Just going out, putting out fires, starting up. I helped start our IoT business unit as one of the original executives there and stuff. So it's been pretty fun. And now I run our Global Developer Advocacy team. So I have 25, 30 really smart people that do all kinds of stuff. I have no idea what they do. But they run around the world and talk all about great open source technology as well as some of the other technology that we offer. And before that, I did a lot of work in systems and software engineering over the years, all the way back to human interface kinds of things like this with fighter jets and commercial airplanes. So that's kind of why I dabble in some of these things, just because I like to try and see if there's unique ways of visualizing things sometimes, see what we can do.
And it looks like you've collected some positive sentiment.
You're getting a little better, yeah.
So, one of those.
I don't see any red.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it keeps popping in and out. I guess the cell signal's so weak here that it'll show a little bit every now and then.
Feel free to tweet either positive or negative feelings about all the things that we're talking about here, and we'll.
It's Verizon's fault. Put it on the screen.
Awesome. Well, so I'd love to hear a little bit more also about the history of these projects, right? So why don't we start again, Grant? If you want to tell us a little bit about Thread, both the technology itself and also OpenThread specifically, and sort of how this came to be and how this project came to be available when it was open sourced, what, a year, 18 months ago?
Yeah, about 18 months ago.
Something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, so the genesis of Thread really started with the genesis of Nest, in fact. Nest is a small startup company, was looking at some of the same challenges that Zach here talked about during the keynote, challenges of IoT, but particularly for the consumer in the home space. And we were looking for a low-cost wireless technology to connect the products that we knew that we were going to build at Nest, as well as all the ecosystem products that we knew that our partners and people in the ecosystem were going to build. But we couldn't find a technology that met all the requirements that we had, and we went out and looked at all sorts of different things, and there were things that were great technologically but far too expensive to put in a consumer product, and there were things that were maybe technologically okay, but they needed to build gateways and hubs and that kind of thing, and that wasn't our vision for the connected home. Our vision for the connected home was open and open systems based. And so we created Thread out of a need to really create a technology that didn't exist. And as we were on this journey, we actually found a number of other companies that shared that same vision that we did. And so we came together and formed the Thread Group. And once we launched the standard, first version came out in about 2015. Second version of the standard came out in 16. And as we were creating the second version of the standard, we realized, again, to really juice the environment and kind of get things going, we needed to do something that was really going to help adoption. That was an open source implementation that could really allow people to run faster than any of the individual organizations that were behind Thread. And that really proved successful. Today we've got nearly 20 some odd certified stacks and components. We now have Particle joining the product mix. Things are really taking off for Thread, and open source was really a key part of that.
Yeah, I mean, our experience with Thread has been it's such a great implementation. It's reliable, it's robust, it's efficient. It's sort of exactly what we needed when we looked around for something to use for particle mesh. But one of the things that we saw when we started working with Thread is that all of the features that are sort of some of the best parts of Thread about its reliability, its robustness, its security, felt like they're useful regardless of the application, but it had been designed in the context of the connected home. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the sort of connected home part of IoT, the rest of the industry, industrial applications, and how Thread may be useful, and a little bit of the story there.
Yeah, it's absolutely a great point. I think we made a prescient decision looking back at Thread that we started off with the home as our focus for the market. But we wanted to basically stop at the network layer because we knew the innovation that was going to happen, whether it was going to be at Nest or at other companies that were going to come after Nest, was going to be far beyond what we could anticipate. And so building a secure, reliable, low-power IP-based wireless network and letting innovation flourish on top of that is really, again, what allowed us to start with the home, but then have other companies come along. In fact, now we're seeing a tremendous interest in commercial to say, hey, Thread actually works for us, and the use cases that you defined for the home were great, but they actually work for us in commercial and industrial and beyond. And so really building a foundational technology that people can kind of stand on the shoulders of giants and build and innovate upon is really great, and we're thrilled about that.
Awesome, very cool. Amanda, I'd love to hear the story about Visual Studio Code, and in particular, of course, Visual Studio Code came around when there was already Visual Studio.
That's right.
So tell me about how that happened.
Sure. So actually, I've been involved in a number of open source projects at Microsoft over the years, and it's been really fascinating to kind of see that evolve from TypeScript to Chakra to JavaScript, to VS Code. VS Code really started actually in a similar place to the original Particle developer environment in an online editing experience. And what we were trying to do at the time was, as we were anticipating building up Azure and thinking about the developers that we wanted to bring to Azure, we had a large base of Visual Studio users that were primarily .NET and a lot of C++ developers using Visual Studio. But when it came to JavaScript development or Python development, we didn't really have tools that were speaking to those audiences. And when we were thinking about the cloud, and the cloud not just being a Windows cloud, but also being a Linux cloud, that was really an audience of developers that we needed to go attract. And so what we started with was really an online development experience that we codenamed Monaco, that some people might have used at the time. But basically it was inside of the Azure portal, you could click a little button and you would see the online hosted editing experience that obviously had to be written in JavaScript. It was actually written in TypeScript, which is a typed superset of JavaScript. And that, while I think it was powerful and people enjoyed using it, there were a couple of downsides. Not just from a user experience perspective, oftentimes developers really need to be able to interact with what's on their local environment. They want to be able to copy and paste things. They want to be able to upload files or bring files into their developer environment, and that was harder with a web IDE. It also was limited in terms of the way that we could view kind of your local files. It also meant that you had to be connected. You had to be able to connect to the Azure portal. And then lastly, because it was actually essentially compute running in the Azure cloud to provide it, it was costly. So it was costly either for us to subsidize it. We basically could pay for your compute use to actually run that development environment, or we could pass it along into your subscription and make you pay for the cost of running that developer environment. And it really just didn't take off. It was just a fail, total fail. We had about 4,000 monthly active users, I think, at the peak. So with that, we knew we had to pivot. And the core of the base of VS Code was strong. It was a great foundation of a developer environment, and it was written in JavaScript and TypeScript. So it meant that with the introduction of the Electron application platform, which is based on top of the Chromium code base, we basically took that Monaco developer environment, rehosted it inside of Electron, and created a desktop application. And that was in 2015-ish is when we launched it. You know, we were optimistic, but I would say not necessarily confident that it was going to become such a hit that it actually became. You know, I think through a lot of hard work over the last 3 years, we've really tried to make it something that people enjoy using.
So given that the previous product had 4,000 users and the current product now has, I don't know if you...
About 4 million.
4 million, so
yeah.
A couple of orders of magnitude.
Yeah.
I mean, what were your expectations for what the adoption of the product was going to look like, and how has it been different than what you originally expected?
Well, it certainly grew a lot faster than we expected. You know, I think that we always have, you know, in developer tools, we know the importance of having an API and having extensibility, and how much that actually fuels and powers developer environments. Because to be honest, you know, developers are very capable technologists at figuring out how to solve their own problems. And so one of the most important principles that we put in there was that it was extensible from the beginning. And so with that, you know, by building just the core foundation of a core editor, and we specifically went after JavaScript developers first to kind of help facilitate the Node community to come on board. With that, we could then get community to start to produce Python extensions and Go extensions and Ruby extensions, and basically fairly quickly the user experience started to kind of fill out across a whole bunch of different developer environments. And I would say that, you know, while we really have focused a lot on the Node community, JavaScript and TypeScript community, and it is our #1 user base, we have about 1 million Node developers on top of that 4 million VS Code. We still have 3 million that are made up of everything else, you know, C, C++, .NET, Python, PHP, you know, everything. And it's actually a pretty wide variety of developers for the rest of the 3 million.
Yeah, and we've, you know, when we look at Workbench, we're taking advantage of both the underpinnings of Visual Studio Code, but also the support for C++ and sort of additional features that have been built on top, some of which have been built by Microsoft, some of which have been built by the community,
right.
And all result in just a, you know, a great overall experience.
Right, and what's great about that is not just VS Code, but also the extensions are open source. So we will continue to contribute to them. If there's something that's missing for the Particle Workbench, you can also contribute to those extensions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool. Greg, let's talk a little bit about Node-RED. You talked about Nick and as sort of the founder
Dave CJ's
of the
the other one, yeah.
Yeah. So like, how did Node-RED come to be, and how did it get to be what it is today?
You know, I think as you were talking, like you outlined kind of the prototypical open source project. That's how they work. If you ever want to be famous or invent one yourself, it's go solve kind of a tight little problem, make it open, make it extensible, and get the community involved. And that's what Nick and Dave did with Node-RED. They were out, well, they're both a couple Brits, so they're probably drinking beer somewhere, and thought about this problem of how do we program millions of devices, or how do we manage, you know, from IBM's point of view, it's the data coming off of them that we're interested in. It's like, how do we kind of stay above the fray of the hardware, but then work on the data that comes and goes with them, and easy ways for people to be able to program them, or even for non-programmers to be able to do it, like you guys are doing with the rules engine, right? So how can we build something? And so they noodle around with that, and they both have been researching a lot of, you know, visual programming, and then IBM invented flow programming back in the 60s, I think. It kind of has roots all the way back in there. And they just hacked up a couple of things and thought it was pretty neat. and started as an open source project from the very beginning, and ended up with a core group of contributors, like handfuls, in less than a dozen, I think, in the early days. And it hasn't even been around that long. It's been 5 years, maybe, something like that. It hasn't been that long of a project. And it really took off because people were, kind of astounded at how easy it was then to just drag and drop, put some stuff in, blow it down on the device, and off you go. So I think that's where it came from. They just saw kind of a neat little need, wanted to experiment with JavaScript a little bit, put this thing together, and boom, off it went. The same idea, made it extensible, made it really open. I think the other big thing is licensing you have to watch out for, both on what license you decide you're going to put on something, but make sure you don't get trapped in some of the other, there's some very restrictive license you have to be careful with. So you have to be willing when you start these things to have a pretty good license. Like I think MIT is a real popular one. Some of the Apache licenses are really good. Those are the good ones. There's some others that you have to watch out for.
Yeah. So my understanding, tell me if this is correct, is that when Node-RED was originally envisioned, it was really focused on being something that was going to be deployed to the device. So like, assuming that we're running a sort of some system that's running Linux or something along those lines like a Raspberry Pi, and that the flows would be about dealing with data within the device, but that it's really expanded to be cloud side as well. And I'm not sure which one is the sort of driver right now of the adoption.
Yeah,
you mentioned some numbers earlier.
Adoption side, it's right now about 50% has been deployed to cloud somewhere. From what we can tell, it's sometimes a little tricky to see what comes out of NPM on that,
Right.
Because that's outside of our control, so we don't really know. And Nick hasn't done a lot of instrumentation on purpose, but yeah, I think it was originally conceived to be a simple embedded device programmer. Just because of that, people didn't want to get down and write assembly code or even C code or some of that anymore. They wanted to just be able to quickly draw it and off you go. And my house is loaded with, I think I have 14 Raspberry Pis around my house doing crazy things. Every one of them is running Node-RED, communicating, but then I have a big giant pile of Node-RED on IBM Cloud that's running this thing, a bunch of home automation stuff. Same idea. So it's easy then to have all these Node-RED instances, and then they all can connect together in a bunch of different ways. And then we saw then that was like, well, this is pretty cool. Let's add, because you can extend it. Okay, let's add the Watson stuff. Let's add competitors. Let's figure out how we can containerize it and all this other crazy stuff. And all of a sudden it became a pretty neat cloud programming tool as well, so that you don't even really have to worry about the device side. And that same idea was IBM's idea of, well, what can we do with the data? And what interesting things can we do? And how easy can we make it, or how accessible can you make it for non-programmers, if you can? And so that seems to be taken off quite a bit too. It's kind of crazy, because you're right, it was originally conceived as being able to program a Pi or something smaller than that even.
Yeah.
Like I said, anything that runs JavaScript.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting, common stories that I hear is that in each case we see a really powerful technology that ends up getting used in, to some extent, unexpected ways, both in terms of the sort of just popularity of the product, but also getting pulled in different directions, whether it's different programming environments, it's different, being deployed in different places, it's different use cases for the core technology. And I think that's one of the great things about open source is you don't have to necessarily say exactly what it's for. You might have an idea, but it creates an opportunity for customers to take the product in whatever direction feels most appropriate. Greg, you mentioned an interesting issue about licensing, right? And I'm curious to talk about that a little bit. And in particular, all three of you work for big organizations. These are technologies that were developed within large companies, and large companies often have strict ideals about IP and ownership, and I'm sure it's always a struggle to figure out what's open sourced and what's proprietary. And so I'm curious to hear about that journey and how your organizations have sort of thought that through. And maybe Grant, if we can start and talk about Thread, right? Was originally built as a technology inside Nest and was pulled out of Thread Group. How did that happen, and how did the organization get comfortable with the idea of making it an open source technology?
Yeah, so that actually it had an interesting genesis. As I mentioned during this kind of journey of creating Thread, we really did come up with these original other 7 companies that were interested at the time. There was an organization that actually existed amongst those 7 companies even before Thread started called the JSA, the Joint Stakeholders Agreement. And it was basically a corporate handshake agreement that said we're all going to contribute a lot of intellectual property to make this technology available, and we want it to be openly available for free so that people like Particle that come later and adopt it can ship it at scale with no licensing fees. So that meant, again, to Greg's earlier point, a very liberal IPR policy that said, hey, we're going to contribute a lot of IP, and we're going to put it in this technology, we're going to make that investment, and we're going to put it out there in the world. And so really it lived within those 7 companies for only a very short period of time before all that intellectual property just effectively got handed over through licensing to the thread group itself. And then once the open source came along, it was really, as Greg said, coming up with an open source policy that married well with the organization's IPR policy so that there were no conflicts between those two, so that people could adopt the open source, continue to implement open source, and not have the conflict with the original intellectual property policy of the thread group and all the companies like Google that put IP into it.
Yeah. Amanda, Microsoft has gone through a revolution in terms of open source, and so I expect some of that timing sort of coincides with the development of this product. So how did that story sort of integrate with the development of VS Code?
Yeah, I mean, definitely my experience at Microsoft over the last 10 years has been all about kind of, what it means to do more and more open source, and the experience is pretty dramatically different. In 2010, we started working on something called TypeScript. How many of you guys are familiar with TypeScript? Yeah. And actually, that was originally designed as something that was only intended for internal consumption. Office was starting to build the Office 365 product at the time and had tens of thousands of C# developers that all of a sudden needed to develop JavaScript. And they really had no idea, first of all, how to get JavaScript to scale. But secondly, they just didn't understand kind of the runtime specifics of the JavaScript environment. And so there were solutions that would, transpile C# down to JavaScript, but we were finding all kinds of problems with that. And so TypeScript was kind of intended as a way to make it much more approachable. But we knew that if we started with just having a first-party Microsoft internal product that got no external traction, that would be a big problem. Because over time, that would mean that we ended up with our own internal developers in their own closed ecosystem, and they wouldn't be able to benefit from the broad community of developers that are continuing to evolve the JavaScript development experience incredibly rapidly. So we knew from the get-go that we needed TypeScript to actually be an open source project that was embraced by the broader community and kind of welcomed and iterated upon. And so my experience of trying to get TypeScript approved for open source at Microsoft back in the summer of 2012, I guess, or 2011, I think. It took about 6 months for me to get up through the management layers to get TypeScript approved. But over that next couple of years, we open sourced .NET, and that kind of made it a little bit easier. And we started to get much more familiar with what it looked like to do that. And then when it was end of 2015, we were also looking at taking the Chakra engine, which is the JavaScript engine that powers the Edge browser. And if you think about the contrast between TypeScript, the role that plays, and the Chakra engine, very, very different from a security profile perspective in terms of the risk that it represents to Microsoft. TypeScript basically takes programming language that you've written that's basically JavaScript, compiles down to JavaScript, essentially harmless from a security perspective. There's nothing that's going to turn that into executable code until the JavaScript engine actually interprets it. Whereas our JavaScript engine is interfacing with millions, billions of web pages every single day, potentially many, many harmful, malicious payloads that it actually has to deal with, and it's then executing it in the Windows kernel. And so the security profile difference between the two makes Chakra a much more risky component to actually bring to open source. But just to contrast, when we tried to bring Chakra to become open source in end of 2015, that actually took about a month for us to get approved by the muckety mucks. So that
their official
shows,
title?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, and I think, now that we've seen the incredible success that we've seen, not just with VS Code, but also with the growth of .NET over the last couple of years, I think that there definitely is a tidal change in terms of the attitude towards open source at Microsoft. And of course, the fact that we have Satya as the CEO doesn't hurt as well.
Cool.
Yeah.
Greg, Node-RED, you said originally envisioned as an open source project.
Right.
So, I mean, I'd love to hear especially what put the founding team in a position to be able to sort of envision it in that way, and what were the sort of forces at IBM that were positive and negative in that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I guess in the 10 years I've been there, IBM runs on its legal team more than anything else. It seems like they write, we write lots of patents, and so they sue everybody on the planet. It seems like protecting our patents, right? And then on the other side, we really embrace open source, and we've kind of cut our teeth, I guess, over the past 10 or 15 years. Although I've seen the same kind of thing, I think, as it is with Amanda, a real sea change in the developers' mindsets, and maybe it's because the old ones are moving out and the young ones are coming in, about being a lot more open to open source and embracing it more of, all right, we'll start with that and then we'll build our product on top of it. Where 10 years ago, it was more like, no, that stuff's junk, we're going to write our own. It's like, no, normally that stuff's a lot better than anything you're going to write. So there's an attitude shift that happened there. I think when it comes down to Nick and Dave as they were pursuing that, I think they wanted from the get-go to make it open source because they saw what had happened with, I don't know, a little bit with Linux or Eclipse or some of those early projects that IBM was deeply involved in. I'm not commenting on their age, but they saw that there was some advantage to that, because then if you could build this platform and this foundation, not only did it help your company and your organization, help their eminence a little bit, but it got this altruistic, we're going to help the community of software engineers and maybe expand it. And that's, I think, more than anything, the way that they sort of justified it. It's like, hey, IBM, we've built this thing, and what it's going to do is bring more people in to use our technology. It's not necessarily that we want to sell this for $100 a pop. It's that if it's free and it makes everything else easier to use, then you're going to get more consumption. And I think that's where you have to make that decision, is why would I open source this? Well, it's because it's painful to produce or it's really expensive. Okay, great, let's open source it. You might get 2 people on it. But if it's something that makes everybody's world easier in one way or another, then I think that's why you see the big uptake. Threads is another one. You see Kubernetes is a huge uptick here recently. All the stuff that's going on with blockchain and Hyperledger and all that stuff is just gone nuts, because it's solving a particular business application. It makes everybody's life easier. Doesn't tie you to anything proprietary, yet you can take that and build and make money on it because you're incorporating it into some other product or some solution that you're actually trying to solve a problem with. It just seems like it just makes things easier for everyone that way. And I think that's the attitude at IBM. That is pretty easy for us now to say, I want to open source this thing. You fill out a questionnaire, a lawyer calls you, they're like, okay, which group are you going to donate it to? And so it was a big battle between the JS Foundation and a couple of others that wanted Node-RED. And I was getting these phone calls, and my boss was getting calls, and everybody's getting all these phone calls from people lobbying to have Node-RED, which was pretty funny. And we tried to pick, somebody that was not necessarily focused on a particular industry or technology, but to try and keep it up at a higher level. And that's why we chose JS Foundation. Yeah. And then it was a simple boilerplate donation letter from IBM. They had done it so many times. They were like, here's the code, here you go, swatch it on the butt, off you go, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it was pretty painless. Same thing. It took 2 or 3 weeks to get it through all of the channels and the right elephants and other heads. But in general, it's much easier than it would have been 10 years ago. It would have been like, you're giving away our what?
Yeah. Yeah.
What? We spent a lot of money on that. It's like, no. This stuff is, package it up. We're going to give this away. So.
One of the things you've all talked about is the value of sort of community around these open source projects, right? In the context of having a developer community makes it easier for folks to solve their own problems, to solve each other's problems, to build on additional features and add sort of extensible features to the core underpinnings of the product. And so I'm curious to hear about what are some of the ways that you've seen the community create value back into your organizations, and what are some of the ways that you've encouraged and facilitated that community to grow in a strong and healthy way?
Yeah, for us, we have a unique and interesting challenge in that regard, in which Thread cultivates a certification program, and we want to make sure, because it's networking at the end of the day, that an implementation that Particle produces, if it touts being Thread compatible, works with one produced by another company. So when we do have innovation within the Thread ecosystem, we want to make sure that it's either additive innovation, which is it's a new feature that maybe doesn't break the existing spec, but adds new functionality that maybe adds value add to this particular person. Or it just makes the implementation better, faster. So for example, Thread has a routing algorithm, and there's been lots of contributions to that routing algorithm to make it more optimal for this use case, for this use case. And again, there may not be use cases that the original Thread founders thought of, but for that particular customer, great. As long as it doesn't break anything else, more power to them. So that is a unique wrinkle that does exist in our ecosystem that we have to kind of manage and make sure nothing breaks. But we do nonetheless want that innovation and kind of driving things forward.
Yeah. How do you encourage folks to participate and sort of, add more value to the thread itself?
So another great way that kind of comes back to us is we're a member-driven organization, and as we develop new versions of the specification, those really come to us through membership. And so the great thing now is we have an open source community that kind of allows people to prototype ideas and vet them in the open and kind of get that momentum before they come to a member meeting. And now rather than coming to a member meeting saying, hey, we've got this idea and we can whiteboard it, we can say, hey, we've got this idea and we've got 2,000 people in the open source community that have used our beta, they love it, they've tried the algorithm, and this actually works in production, let's go do it. And that just means there's a lot less debate about should it or shouldn't it go into the spec, and it can be kind of test by proof of implementation as opposed to test by whiteboard, and it just moves through the process that much faster.
Better way to understand demand and what people actually need.
Exactly.
Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely holds true, I think, especially for things that I've been involved in that are kind of more like standards-based. Like, for example, the evolution of the ECMAScript standard, which is the standard that determines kind of what is in the JavaScript language, very much runs in that way, where there is a kind of like multi-organizational body that governs it. And when there is someone who has a proposal for it, they bring it to that body and it gets reviewed, and it oftentimes needs not just a clear spec, but also a reference implementation of that spec and people who have actually adopted and have used it and have real use cases for it. And I think that absolutely works, especially for standards-based kinds of solutions. In the case of VS Code, it's slightly different because while we do have some standards that VS Code really relies on, we have something called the LSP, which is the Language Service Protocol, that basically is the standard that any new programming language implements to be able to show up in the VS Code environment. And there are a couple of other standards, debugging standards, et cetera, that are also at the core of VS Code. Really, it's an application at the end of the day. And so it's unlike a standard in that way, and that we're kind of delivering basically an end-to-end user experience. But at the same time, it's not necessarily something that we have 100% control over. Once you create extensibility points in your application, your users are going to find creative ways to really make the most of those extensibility points.
And break it.
Yeah, sure, that's true. And actually, that's one of the things that we had to build into VS Code from the get-go, is kind of a defensive approach to how VS Code is designed, to make sure that if you have a poorly performing extension, that it doesn't kind of take down the entire VS Code user experience. And actually, that's one of the lessons that we've learned from the Visual Studio extensibility model, which we're trying to reform now that we have the VS Code lesson learned. But basically, the way that it works is, we have a core team of developers in the core VS Code code base. That's about 20 people, 10 people in Zurich and 10 people in Redmond. And any submission to the core code base gets reviewed by that group. And our goal with VS Code, when we kind of came up with it, I told you the origin story a minute ago, but basically the niche that we're trying to fill is a lightweight code editing experience with just a little bit of debugging that makes you super productive. We are not trying to build a full-fledged IDE. we have Visual Studio and VS for Mac. That is kind of that cockpit operating system level IDE experience that we're trying to ship there. So with that, really anything that somebody submits, that as long as they're not, making VS Code become a honking IDE, is basically fair game, as long as it's not going to, kind of corrupt the core resiliency and integrity of the VS Code experience itself.
Greg?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to, I think there's pieces of any of these open source things. We look at MQTT as a communication standard. You have to run some protocol test suites on it because you have to be able to certify that you can talk to other people. So there's that element of control. And then you look at something like, maybe some of the older communities like Java or some of those, you propose some changes or you show that this particular thing is going to do a thing and there's a steering committee perhaps that leads it. And some of them just run on beer and pizza. You just kind of show up and feed them and give them something to eat and drink, and that's all you have to do to nurture a community. So it just varies very wildly. You look at Node-RED, for example, so Dave and especially Nick still have ultimate control over some of the core, foundational changes, but it's people contributing nodes and other simple extensions, the same idea. They just throw it out there in the libraries and then they get upvoted and downvoted, and it's pretty clear which ones work or not. You can look in the libraries and go, oh, I'm looking for this, and you go look, wow, it hasn't been updated in a year, and you look here and it's like, yeah, nobody likes it too much either, so then they kind of live and die by themselves. So there's part of it is just a community votes with their feet in some of these pieces, or add-ons, for example. Some of it's just not a good add-on, that people have proposed or that they've put out there, and then after a while it just withers, falls away anyway.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I would add is, we get incredibly fast feedback from our developer community. One of the reasons why I love working for developers as my customers is because you guys are passionate tech enthusiasts. And so when we have a release, either a nightly release or whatever, we get feedback absolutely immediately as to whether or not that's good or not. And we've had episodes in the past where either we've released things or our partners have released things, and the community responds pretty quickly if they like it, but also especially if they dislike it.
The Slack channel goes, I don't know how you keep up with it, but it's just crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And as much as we might have aspirations for steering kind of where we'd like the product to go, ultimately it's the community that has to accept it and be welcoming of the direction.
Yeah. Well, given that ability that the community has to drive the direction and the adoption of these technologies, what are some of the most surprising things that each of you has seen done or built with these sort of open source projects that you're overseeing?
It's a great question. I think when we first started at Nest and then Google building low power IP connected wireless things, there was a group of naysayers that said you could never do it, it can't meet the battery life requirements, it simply can't be done. And so the fact that we've delivered thermostats and smoke detectors and security systems using low power IP wireless, I think has been a really boundary pushing example of that. But as you talked about in the keynote, if you look at IoT and try to put it in a single box, it's so wide and it's so varied. And I think where things really truly get interesting, and that's why I'm so excited about what Particle's doing with Mesh, is there is an incredibly long tail of IoT, and there's value in that long tail, and the things that people are going to do with Particle Mesh and they're going to create is really going to be totally amazing, and it's going to be exciting for those customers because they're going to be doing things they've never done before, and they're going to be doing it because they're standing on the shoulders of giants with all this great technology.
Yeah, I mean, for VS Code, I think there are a couple. I mean, obviously, the domain-specific applications of VS Code, Particle being one example, where really we can use the kind of foundation of VS Code to power an IoT platform. That's exactly what it was designed for. So that's always kind of expected, but very exciting, and exciting to see all of the different kind of partners that want to incorporate VS Code. But we've seen extensions for GraphQL, Docker. I think there are a lot of teams that we've seen based here that have their own internal cloud that are basically using VS Code as a remote developer environment for their internal cloud. Excuse me. One of the things that I'm also really passionate about is bringing more developers into the overall developer community itself. And so one of the other applications of VS Code that's been very exciting is in the education space, where not just the computer science AP through a program called TEALS, but also we have something called Make Code, which is actually an IoT kind of environment for, not just an IoT environment, but Lego Mindstorms and other things like that for K through 12, is also kind of based on top of the VS Code environment.
Yeah. I guess there's a lot of crazy things that people have done with Node-RED. If you want particular examples, one is what Particle does with it. I'd say we see a lot of companies that have started to go out and take the front end and do something interesting with it, like you guys did with Rules Engine. A couple of other people have also done that with some edge routers and edge devices there. I've seen from an application kind of production side, there's several that are listed on the Node-RED site, but one that I think is kind of funny is animatronic dinosaurs. And they do real-time control of these dinosaur things, which is pretty hysterical. A bunch of Raspberry Pis, I think, run it or something weird like that. I don't exactly know how they did it, but that was pretty wild. I've seen people actually using drones to go inspect cell phone towers and then run all that through Node-RED and do image recognition on the antennas and the wiring to look for damage, so that way somebody doesn't have to actually climb up there and look. Right. So it's a workplace safety kind of thing. An insurance company has instrumented, like on a construction site, your safety vest and your helmet. And the same thing, everybody's connected, and we're looking for falls or overexertions, workplace injuries, or maybe this person hasn't moved in a while. Let's go find out what's going on. Maybe they fainted or had a heart attack or whatever, something like that. Interesting applications in that area. One that one of my teammates built, for an example, is using the particle asset tracker and doing disaster relief tracking with that. So you stick it on some high value cargo. Like we did some other things where people are sticking it on nuclear waste materials or whatever. Anything that you want to keep a good track on where it is, and then also watch its temperature and G-forces and everything else, and then use blockchain to record everything, so that then you have this immutable record that everybody interested in something that's high value, or like, say, like a nuclear waste thing, then the government agencies can look at it, and the international agencies can look at it, the owners and the source and all that, so everybody can see it through blockchain. So you have these real-time IoT devices detecting something interesting, sticking it in a blockchain, then that everybody else sees, and nobody can falsify, you might say, or go back and redact.
Well, I'm glad we got to the intersection between IoT and blockchain, because I don't think it would be a good IoT keynote.
Two high buzzwords.
If we didn't get there, yeah,
in one sentence.
Smush the buzzwords together.
But blockchain and IoT are incredible technologies that have been waiting for each other. They really are. There is something in there that's going to explode all over the place, right? You can see it. At least it's obvious to me that there's something big. It's not just a financial thing, and it's not Bitcoin. There's some really big things that are going to happen there with digital contracts and electronics in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. So last question for the group, we're just running out of time here, is I expect a lot of folks in the audience who may find themselves working on these kinds of projects and organizations that are not yet comfortable with open source, right? So what do you say, what advice can you offer to folks who are interested in seeing their companies invest in open source, whether that means adopting open source technologies or open sourcing some of the things that they're building themselves? What advice can you offer to help create organizations that are comfortable with those kinds of things?
I think one, make sure that your legal team is friendly and well-versed, and if they're not, send them off to some conferences and get them comfortable first, because if your lawyers aren't on board, it's going nowhere.
Yep.
I think they're called mucky mucks. That was the,
Those might be a different group of people possibly, though. But I think once you've gotten your legal team on board, just work with them and follow the giants that have come before you. I mean, as everyone's been talking about, I did my first open source project back in 1998 at Brocade Communications, and that was pulling teeth. But there's just so much work that's been done since then, and so much progress with licenses. Stand on the shoulders of giants, follow the giants, follow in their well-worn path. And as a small company, as a small organization, you'll be fine, you'll be successful.
Yeah, we've built an open source handbook that all of our developers take training, and I brought it with me. It's not proprietary. If you want a copy, drop me a note. I'll be happy to share it with you. It's about 30 pages of here are the considerations and stuff that you have to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you had said earlier, both the MIT license and the Apache 2 license are two that we use very, very regularly at Microsoft and are basically, friendly to kind of often enterprise use case scenarios.
GPL and LGPL, stay away from.
Yes, I won't go into
Those are
that.
two you don't want to get close to.
Start with Apache and MIT, and I think those are two that are fairly well received by corporate legal teams. The other thing that I would do is just think about what's the business case for building an ecosystem around what you're trying to build. If you're thinking about consuming open source, then that's really about, okay, how quickly do you want your innovation to be able to progress, and kind of what's the differentiated portion of what you are building, right? If you want to build something, but there's already something that exists in the open source community that fills your needs, that's a much faster way to get started than to have to build everything from the ground up. And so if you can make a case that actually will improve your team's agility and time to market, I think ultimately you will prevail on that one. And then if you're thinking about open sourcing your own component, you really need to think about it from the perspective of what's the ecosystem that you're trying to create around your product.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you just want to get a bunch of people to debug your code for you, because that's not really going to work.
It's just not going to happen. Yeah.
I think Grant, you said it well earlier, which is, open source creates an opportunity for folks to stand on the shoulders of giants. Given the products we announced today, each of you has, and the companies you and the organizations you represent, has created these incredible technologies that we're able to stand on top of to create something for our customers that they can stand on top of. So giants all the way down, I guess. But thank you so much for the products that you've created, and thanks for joining me on stage today.
Sure.
Really great having you here at Spectra. So,
Thanks,
Zach.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.
Zach. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good stuff. Thanks.
All right, we're just bringing our keynote here to a close. So thanks so much, everybody, for coming to spend the day with us today here at Spectra. I'm going to pass it back to Megan, who's going to talk about the rest of the day and what to expect. Hope you enjoyed the conversation we've had so far, the products that we've announced, and I hope to see some of you out around the conference through the rest of the day. So thanks again for coming.